Welcome to this remarkable war survival chronicle where forgotten civilian wisdom met the collapse of armies and nations. Before we begin, tell us in the comments where you're listening from and the exact time this story found you. These quiet war stories often travel farther than battles ever did. In the winter of 1945, when victory celebrations had faded and the real work of survival began, a collection of handwritten notes was discovered in the basement of a damaged boarding house in Portland, Oregon. These papers, found wedged behind a loose brick near a makeshift coal storage area, would remain unexamined until 1963, when urban renewal workers stumbled upon what appeared to be a detailed survival manual written in careful script across torn envelope backs and grocery receipt margins. The notes belonged to Cordelia Vance, a 34-year-old telegraph operator whose husband had been declared missing in action over the Pacific in late 1943. What made these documents extraordinary was not their emotional content. There was little, but their methodical documentation of civilian survival techniques during the infrastructure collapse that followed the war's end. Mrs. Vance had transformed her small apartment above Henley's hardware store into what military historians would later recognize as a model of urban survival efficiency, using nothing but materials available to any civilian during the rationing period. The first entry, dated February 3, 1945, began with a simple observation. No deliveries for 6 days. Coal truck driver says railroad bridge repairs indefinite. Mrs. Patterson, downstairs, burning furniture legs. The matter-of-fact tone continued throughout 47 separate notes, each documenting a specific technique, measurement, or observation about maintaining life when supply chains failed and municipal services became unreliable. During the harsh winter of 1945, most Americans living in damaged urban areas faced challenges that victory parades never mentioned. Bomb damage to West Coast cities, though limited compared to European devastation, had created pockets of infrastructure failure that lasted months after the war's official end. Railroad repairs, bridge reconstruction, and the chaos of military demobilization meant that civilian supply lines, already strained by wartime rationing, became completely unreliable in many areas. The Pacific Northwest experienced particularly severe conditions during this period. Japanese balloon bombs had caused scattered damage to electrical infrastructure throughout Oregon and Washington. While casualties were minimal, the attacks disrupted power grids and transportation networks in ways that continued affecting civilian life long after the weapons stopped falling. Combined with severe winter weather and delayed reconstruction efforts, many urban areas faced conditions that tested civilian resilience to its absolute limits. Mrs. Vance's notes revealed that she had prepared for this possibility months before the war ended. Her background as a telegraph operator had provided her with access to communication networks that ordinary civilians lacked. She had observed patterns in supply disruptions, transportation delays, and infrastructure failures that suggested the transition from wartime to peacetime conditions would create extended periods of civilian hardship. This information had prompted her to begin systematic preparation, while most Americans focused on victory celebrations and the return of normal commerce. Her first significant entry detailed a technique she called thermal layering, using newspaper, cardboard, and available fabric to create insulation systems that could maintain body temperature in unheated rooms. She had calculated that 4 layers of newspaper, held in place by torn strips of cotton cloth, could provide the equivalent warmth of a wool blanket. The measurements were precise. Newspaper strips 18 inches by 12 inches, overlapped by 3 inches, secured with cotton ties every 6 inches. The system could be assembled in 30 minutes and provided effective insulation for temperatures down to 20 degrees Fahrenheit when worn inside buildings that blocked wind but provided no heat. But what separated survival from mere endurance was Mrs. Vance's approach to resource management. While neighbors burned furniture and raided abandoned buildings for burnable materials, she had spent the autumn of 1944 collecting discarded wood scraps, paper, and fabric according to a systematic plan. Her notes described a storage system that maximized the heating value of available materials while minimizing space and fire risk. Small wood pieces were sorted by density and size, stored in ventilated areas that prevented moisture accumulation but remained accessible during severe weather. The technical details filled page after page. Coal could be stretched by mixing it with sawdust and water, then compressing the mixture into brick-shaped forms that burned slower and generated more consistent heat than loose coal. A single bag of coal, rationed at 1 bag per month per household, could be extended to 6 weeks using this technique. The process required no special equipment, just a bucket, available sawdust from the hardware store below, and patience to let the bricks dry for 3 days before use. Mrs. Vance documented that these compressed coal bricks burned at a steady rate that could be calculated precisely, allowing accurate planning of fuel consumption over extended periods. Water management presented another critical challenge. Municipal water service remained functional, but heating that water required fuel that couldn't be wasted. Ms. Vance documented a system using large tin cans and available copper tubing to create a passive solar water heating system that functioned even during overcast winter days. The setup used reflective surfaces, polished tin cans, and mirrors salvaged from damaged buildings to concentrate available light onto a coil of copper pipe painted black with available stove blacking. Even on cloudy days, this system could raise water temperature by 15 to 20 degrees, reducing fuel needed for washing and cooking. The construction details of this heating system demonstrated remarkable ingenuity within severe material constraints. Copper tubing, salvaged from damaged plumbing, was coiled into a spiral pattern inside a wooden box lined with tin foil from cigarette packages and food containers. The box was covered with available glass, mostly picture frame glass and window panes recovered from damaged buildings. Reflective surfaces were positioned using geometric calculations that maximized light concentration while remaining stable in wind conditions that could reach 40 miles per hour during Pacific Northwest winter storms. Food preservation without reliable refrigeration required techniques that most urban civilians had forgotten. Mrs. Vance's notes described methods for extending the life of available foods using salt, vinegar, and controlled drying that could be accomplished in any apartment. Potatoes could be preserved for months by storing them in sand or sawdust in cool, dark areas. Cabbage could be fermented into sauerkraut using only salt and available jars, creating a vitamin source that prevented scurvy during periods when fresh vegetables became unavailable. The fermentation process required precise timing and measurement to prevent spoilage that could waste precious food resources. Mrs. Vance documented that cabbage should be chopped into quarter-inch strips, mixed with salt at a ratio of 2 tablespoons per pound of cabbage, then packed into jars with enough pressure to force liquid to the surface. Fermentation required temperatures between 60 and 70 degrees Fahrenheit and took 14 to 21 days, depending on ambient conditions. The process created food that could be stored without refrigeration for 6 months, while providing essential vitamins that prevented malnutrition. Root vegetables could be preserved using techniques adapted from rural farming communities. Carrots, turnips, and parsnips were stored in layers of sand or sawdust that maintained proper humidity while preventing decay. Mrs. Vance calculated storage ratios precisely. 1 bushel of vegetables required 2 bushels of sand or 3 bushels of sawdust for optimal preservation. Storage containers could be improvised from available wooden boxes, tin containers, or even cardboard lined with paper and wax from available sources. The community dynamics documented in these notes revealed the moral complexity of survival during infrastructure collapse. Mrs. Vance recorded instances of neighbors sharing resources, but also the gradual breakdown of social cooperation as winter deepened and supplies dwindled. She noted that successful survival required balancing individual preparation with selective community cooperation, helping those who had also prepared while avoiding the drain of supporting those who had made no provisions for themselves. Her observations about community behavior during crisis revealed patterns that military sociologists would later recognize as typical of civilian populations under extended stress. Initial cooperation gave way to competition as resources became scarce. Families that had prepared adequately became targets for desperate neighbors who had made no provisions. Social hierarchies based on peacetime status collapsed, replaced by influence structures based on competence, resources, and willingness to share knowledge that improved community survival prospects. One particularly detailed entry described the arrival of 3 wounded soldiers who had been discharged from military hospitals but had no transportation to reach their homes in the Midwest. Mrs. Vance documented her decision to shelter these men for 2 weeks, sharing her carefully managed resources while they recovered enough strength to continue their journey. The calculations were precise. Additional occupancy required increasing daily fuel consumption by 40%, but the soldiers contributed labor for improvements to her heating system and helped fortify her apartment against break-ins that had become common in the area. The soldiers brought military training in improvised construction and resource management that enhanced Mrs. Vance's survival systems. They helped construct a more efficient ventilation system for her coal-burning heater that reduced fuel consumption while improving air quality. Their knowledge of field sanitation prevented disease outbreaks that had affected other buildings in the area. Most importantly, they provided security skills that allowed Mrs. Vance to conduct necessary scavenging expeditions in areas that had become dangerous for unaccompanied civilians. The moral dilemma of resource sharing appeared repeatedly in the notes. Mrs. Vance observed that families who had failed to prepare often became desperate enough to threaten those who had been more prudent. She documented techniques for concealing preparation and resources while maintaining the appearance of struggling equally with unprepared neighbors. Food storage areas were hidden behind false walls, constructed using available lumber and hardware. Coal and wood supplies were distributed among multiple concealed locations throughout the building. Cooking was done during specific hours when food smells would not attract attention from hungry neighbors. Security measures described in the notes reflected the breakdown of civil order that accompanied infrastructure collapse. Windows were reinforced using available boards and metal brackets salvaged from construction sites and damaged buildings. Door locks were supplemented with interior barriers that could be quickly installed each night, heavy furniture positioned to block entry, rope systems that secured doors from inside, and alarm systems using available materials that would alert occupants to attempted intrusion. Mrs. Vance had created multiple escape routes from her apartment, including a concealed passage to the adjacent building's roof that could be used if the main stairway became blocked or dangerous. The escape route required removing specific boards from a shared wall, crawling through the opening, and replacing the boards to conceal the passage. She had practiced this evacuation multiple times during daylight hours to ensure it could be accomplished quickly in darkness during emergency conditions. The psychological aspects of survival received equal attention in the documentation. Mrs. Vance noted that maintaining daily routines prevented the despair that overcame many civilians during the worst weeks of winter. She maintained a schedule of cleaning, mending, and improvement tasks that provided purpose and prevented the mental deterioration she observed in neighbors who spent entire days lying in bed to conserve body heat. Physical exercise, performed in the limited space of her apartment using available materials for resistance, maintained strength and circulation that proved crucial for survival during extreme cold periods. Her exercise routine used materials available in any household to maintain cardiovascular fitness and muscle strength. Water buckets provided resistance for arm exercises. Stair climbing in the building provided cardiovascular conditioning. Stretching routines prevented the joint stiffness that affected many civilians who remained sedentary to conserve calories. Mrs. Vance documented that 15 minutes of daily exercise improved circulation enough to reduce fuel requirements for maintaining comfortable body temperature during sleep. Communication with the outside world required improvisation when telephone and postal services became unreliable. Mrs. Vance documented a system of message exchanges with other survivors using notes left at specific locations, the corner of specific buildings, inside particular mailboxes, under designated rocks in the small park 3 blocks away. This network allowed coordination of resource sharing and warned about dangerous conditions or opportunities for scavenging useful materials. The communication network included coded messages that provided information about resource availability, security threats, and opportunities for beneficial cooperation. Simple symbols indicated whether specific areas were safe for scavenging, whether particular individuals were trustworthy for resource exchanges, and whether dangerous conditions required avoiding specific locations. The coding system used ordinary marks that would not attract attention from hostile individuals who might intercept messages. The technical innovation documented in these notes demonstrated how ordinary civilians could solve survival challenges using available materials and basic knowledge. A heating system using a modified oil drum, copper pipes, and reflective surfaces could warm an entire room using minimal fuel. The construction required only tools available in any hardware store and materials that could be salvaged from damaged buildings throughout the area. Water purification could be accomplished using sand, charcoal, and cloth filters that removed most contaminants from questionable water sources. The filtration system could be assembled using available containers and materials, providing clean drinking water even when municipal systems became contaminated or unreliable. Mrs. Vance documented that this system could process 5 gallons of water per day using materials that cost less than $2 during wartime pricing. Soap could be manufactured using kitchen grease, available lye, and basic chemistry that any adult could master with careful attention to measurements and safety. The soap-making process required exact ratios to prevent chemical burns or ineffective products, but produced cleaning supplies that could be bartered for other necessities when commercial soap became unavailable. Mrs. Vance's approach to scavenging reflected careful planning rather than desperate searching. She had mapped the locations of useful materials throughout the damaged sections of the city, noting which buildings contained copper pipes, usable wood, unbroken glass, or other materials that could improve survival conditions. Scavenging expeditions were planned for specific purposes rather than random exploration, minimizing exposure to dangerous areas while maximizing the value of recovered materials. Her scavenging maps included detailed notes about building conditions, access routes, security risks, and optimal timing for material recovery. She had identified buildings scheduled for demolition where materials could be legally salvaged. She noted locations where construction materials had been abandoned and could be recovered without legal complications. Most importantly, she documented which areas had become controlled by hostile groups and should be avoided completely. The winter of 1945 tested these preparations to their limits. Municipal services failed completely for 3 weeks in March, when damage to the main power plant coincided with a late-season blizzard that dumped 18 inches of snow while temperatures dropped to minus 12 degrees Fahrenheit. During this period, Mrs. Vance's notes recorded daily temperatures, fuel consumption, food usage, and water management with scientific precision. The data revealed that her systematic preparation allowed not only survival, but maintenance of health and strength, while unprepared neighbors suffered malnutrition exposure injuries, and psychological breakdown. Community cooperation during the crisis followed patterns that Mrs. Vance documented with careful attention to successful versus failed approaches. Organized sharing of specific resources, one household providing fuel, another contributing food, a third offering labor, proved more sustainable than informal charity that quickly exhausted prepared individual supplies. Leadership during crisis emerged from those who had demonstrated competence in preparation, not from previous social status or elected positions. The crisis period revealed that survival networks required clear agreements about resource contribution and decision-making authority. Mrs. Vance documented that successful cooperation required explicit agreements about who would make decisions during emergency situations, how resources would be allocated, and what consequences would follow if individuals violated agreements. Communities that operated on informal cooperation collapsed when resources became critically scarce. The discovery of these notes in 1963 sparked interest among military historians studying civilian resilience during infrastructure collapse. The techniques documented by Mrs. Vance were recognized as practical applications of survival principles that could benefit anyone facing similar challenges. Her systematic approach to resource management, community cooperation, and psychological maintenance provided a template for civilian survival that transcended the specific circumstances of post-war urban collapse. Research into similar documentation from other survival situations revealed that Mrs. Vance's techniques were not unique, but represented systematic application of principles that appeared independently among competent civilians facing infrastructure collapse. Military analysts noted that her methods paralleled field survival techniques taught to combat units, suggesting that civilian and military survival requirements shared fundamental principles that could be learned and applied by ordinary individuals. What separated Mrs. Vance from other survivors was not special knowledge or unusual resources, but systematic application of basic principles consistently over time. Every technique she documented could be learned and implemented by any adult with access to commonly available materials and willingness to work methodically rather than react impulsively to crisis conditions. The moral implications of her survival story extended beyond individual technique to questions of community responsibility and resource distribution during crisis. Mrs. Vance had demonstrated that individual preparation enabled community assistance. Her ability to help wounded soldiers and share resources with prepared neighbors resulted from her own systematic provision for crisis conditions. Conversely, those who had made no preparations became burdens that threatened the survival of entire community networks. Her documentation revealed the ethical complexity of survival decisions during prolonged crisis. Should prepared individuals share resources with unprepared neighbors who had ignored obvious warning signs? How could communities balance individual responsibility with collective welfare? Mrs. Vance's note suggested that survival ethics required balancing immediate humanitarian concerns with long-term community sustainability. The final note in the collection, dated April 15, 1945, recorded the return of regular supply deliveries and municipal services. Mrs. Vance documented her transition back to normal conditions, but maintained many of the systems and resource stockpiles that had enabled survival. Her closing observation was characteristically practical. Next winter will come. Systems that work should not be abandoned when times are easy. The techniques documented in these notes were not unique or revolutionary, but represented the systematic application of basic survival principles by an ordinary civilian facing extraordinary circumstances. Mrs. Vance's story demonstrated that survival during infrastructure collapse depended more on consistent preparation and disciplined resource management than on special knowledge or heroic action. The quiet competence documented in her notes provided a template for civilian resilience that remained relevant long after the specific crisis that prompted their creation. In 1967, when urban planners began studying civilian preparedness for various emergency scenarios, Mrs. Vance's notes were microfilmed and distributed among emergency management agencies as an example of practical civilian survival documentation. The techniques she recorded became part of civil defense training materials, stripped of their wartime context, but retaining their essential wisdom about individual preparation, community cooperation, and the systematic approach to crisis survival that transforms potential victims into competent survivors. These forgotten notes remind us that survival wisdom often exists in the margins of official history, recorded by ordinary people who understood that preparation, not luck or heroism, determines who endures when systems fail and who succumbs to circumstances that preparation could have overcome.